Nora had been pretending to be blind for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply look at something. Not quite forgotten. That was the honest answer. She remembered perfectly well. She remembered the specific green of new grass after rain, the way candlelight made a room feel like a secret, the precise expression on a person's face in the moment they thought no one was watching them. She remembered all of it with the particular sharpness of someone who has chosen not to use a sense rather than lost it. The way you might remember the taste of something you've decided never to eat again. She remembered. She simply did not look. The rules were not complicated. Keep your eyes slightly unfocused. Don't track movement. Don't react to things you haven't been told about. Walk with your hand near the wall in unfamiliar spaces, not touching. Just near. Let people guide you, not because you need it, but because people feel useful when they guide you, and useful people ask fewer questions. Never, under any circumstances, meet anyone's eyes directly. She had been doing this since she was 14 years old. She was 24 now. 10 years was a long time to not look at anything directly. Long enough that the habits had become reflexive rather than deliberate. Long enough that she no longer had to think about keeping her gaze soft and slightly downward. Long enough that the performance had stopped feeling like a performance and had become simply the texture of her daily existence. The maids who woke her each morning had never known her any other way. They spoke loudly and clearly when they entered, announced what they were carrying, guided her hands to things with the practiced patience of people who had been doing this for years. They were kind about it, mostly, occasionally a little condescending, in the way of people who equate one limitation with all limitations, who spoke to her slowly about simple things, as though her eyes and her mind were connected in ways that made the failure of one the failure of both. She let them. It was useful. The pack's healer, old Mina, was the only one who knew. Mina had been the one to suggest it, actually, 10 years ago, when the old alpha's son had begun looking at 14-year-old Nora with the particular focused attention of a wolf who has scented something he intends to claim. Mina had taken one look at the situation, taken one look at Nora's face, and said very quietly, close to her ear, "There is a way to buy yourself time. Are you interested?" Nora had been very interested. The claiming laws were specific. A wolf could not formally claim a mate who could not consent fully, and full consent required full capacity. A blind omega, one whose sight had been lost before she could be properly evaluated for a claiming match, fell into a protected category under the old pack laws. She could not be claimed without the alpha's direct intervention and a full council review, a process so complicated and politically expensive that most wolves simply moved on to easier options. Mina had explained all of this in approximately 4 minutes. Then she had asked if Nora understood. Nora had said yes. Mina had handed her a small vial of drops that, applied to the eyes 3 times daily, produced a convincing cloudiness without causing any real damage, and said, "This buys you time, child, not forever. Think carefully about what you do with it." Nora had been thinking carefully about it ever since. She had used the time to read. Voraciously, secretly, at night with the door locked and a blanket over the lamp. She had read history and law and strategy and 3 different languages worth of literature, guiding herself through texts by the light she wasn't supposed to have access to, building a mind that no one in the pack knew existed because they had looked at her clouded eyes and assumed a kind of smallness that she had learned to wear like a second layer of clothing. She had used the time to watch, from behind her unfocused gaze, from beneath lowered lashes, from the corner of a vision that everyone assumed was useless. She had watched the pack for 10 years. She knew exactly who lied and to whom and about what. She knew which alliances were genuine and which were political. She knew where the power actually moved in this pack, not in the alpha's hall where the men made speeches, but in the kitchens and the washing yards, and the quiet evening conversations between women who had been overlooked long enough to say true things freely. She had been planning to leave for 2 years. She had money saved, a route mapped, a contact in a neutral territory who owed Mina a favor and had agreed to help without asking too many questions. She had been waiting for the right moment, which was another way of saying she had been waiting for a moment when she was afraid enough to go and not so afraid that she couldn't move. She had not expected the Alpha King. The Alpha King came to their territory on a Tuesday in early autumn, which struck Nora as an inappropriate day for everything to fall apart. Tuesdays were supposed to be ordinary. She had been in the herb garden, which was one of her few genuine freedoms since blind Nora was considered harmless enough to be allowed outside alone, when she heard the sound of horses and felt the change in the air that happened when something very large and very powerful entered a space. She kept her eyes unfocused. She turned her face in the wrong direction, toward the wall rather than the gate, the way a person would who was orienting by sound rather than sight. She heard the Pax Alpha come out to greet the visitors with more speed than dignity. She heard the formal words of territory acknowledgement, the ritual phrases that meant the guest was powerful enough to require them. And then she heard a voice she had never heard before, low and unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who speaks quietly because they have never needed to be loud to be heard, and something in the center of her chest did something completely unexpected. It simply stopped. Not her heart. Nothing so dramatic, just the constant low-level hum of calculation and watchfulness and careful management of every small thing that had been running underneath her thoughts for 10 years. Just stopped. She turned her face toward the gate before she caught herself, and in the half-second before she corrected it, she looked directly at the man who had just ridden through it. He was already looking at her. The problem with 10 years of practice was that it made you very good at recovering quickly. She corrected her gaze within a heartbeat, turned her face back toward the wall, let her expression settle into the mild, slightly distant look she had perfected, the one that said she was aware of sounds and general shapes but not details. Definitely not the face of a man 30 feet away who was watching her with an expression she had seen for less than 1 second, but which had imprinted itself on the inside of her eyelids with unreasonable clarity. She did not know what his expression had been. Precisely, she had not had time to read it properly. She knew only that it had been focused, entirely, specifically, uncomfortably focused. The way a person looks at something they have just recognized, though she had never seen this man in her life and could not imagine what he might have recognized. She went back to her herbs. She kept her movements slow and familiar. She did not think about the voice. She thought about the voice constantly. His name, she learned through the network of information that flowed through the Pack's domestic spaces largely unobserved, was Kadric, Alpha King Kadric, ruler of 5 territories, commander of the largest unified pack coalition in 3 generations, the man who had ended the border wars that had been bleeding the Eastern Packs for 20 years, by the relatively simple method of personally removing the 3 alphas who had been profiting from them. He was 29 years old. He had been Alpha King for 4 years. He was not married, and had not taken a chosen mate, which was a fact that generated considerable anxious energy in the Pack's upper ranks, because an unmated Alpha King in his prime was the kind of situation that made alphas nervous about their daughters and ambitious about their political options simultaneously. Nora learned all of this by the end of the first evening, sitting quietly in the corner of the great hall during the formal welcome dinner, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes appropriately vague, listening to every conversation in range with the focused attention of someone who has had 10 years to develop their hearing into something close to a professional skill. She also learned, from the whispered conversation between 2 of the Pack's senior women near the serving table, that the Alpha King had asked about her specifically, not by name, by description. He had asked the Pack's Alpha who the young woman was in the herb garden, the one with the dark hair and the gray dress. The Pack's Alpha had told him she was a ward of the Pack. an Omega who had lost her sight in childhood and been taken in out of charity. The Alpha King had said nothing further on the subject, and the conversation had moved on, and that should have been the end of it. Nora had the uncomfortable feeling it was not the end of it. She was right. He found her in the herb garden again the next morning, which suggested he had either followed her specifically or wandered there by coincidence, and she did not believe in coincidences that convenient. She heard him coming. She had good ears. She turned her face toward the sound of his footsteps with the appropriate slight delay of someone orienting by hearing, and she waited. He stopped approximately 6 feet away from her. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood there, and she could feel the particular quality of his attention the way you feel direct sunlight, as something physical and warm and impossible to ignore. "Good morning," he said finally. The same voice. Low, unhurried, she felt it somewhere in her back teeth. "Good morning," she said carefully. She aimed her gaze at approximately his collarbone, which was safe. Eyes unfocused, expression mildly pleasant, the performance running on the deep automatic track it had worn for itself over 10 years. "You were out here yesterday as well," he said, when we arrived. "I like the garden," she said. "I know where everything is." There was a brief pause. "I imagine that matters," he said, "when you can't see it." "Yes," she said. "Familiarity helps." Another pause. Longer this time. "What are you finding?" he asked. The question was specific enough to be interesting. Not "what are you doing" or "can I help?" the usual questions people asked her in the garden. The questions that assumed she needed assistance rather than that she was actually accomplishing something. "What are you finding?" As though he had looked at her hands and the basket and understood that she was working rather than simply existing outdoors. "Rosemary," she said. "The stems near the east wall are ready. And there's wild thyme coming up between the stones that Mina will want." "Which direction is east?" he asked. She pointed. She pointed correctly, because she always knew directions, had always had an instinctive sense of them that had nothing to do with sight. A pause. "You pointed precisely," he said. Without hesitation, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. "I've been in this garden for years," she said, keeping her voice perfectly level. "Direction becomes habitual." He said. That was all. Just that small sound, neutral and thoughtful, that communicated absolutely nothing except that he had heard her and was considering it, which was somehow worse than if he had pressed further. They stood in the garden in the early autumn morning, and she kept her gaze at his collarbone, and he kept looking at whatever he was looking at, and the silence between them was not comfortable so much as it was charged, the way air feels before lightning, full of something that has not happened yet. "I'll let you work," he said eventually. "Thank you," she said. She listened to him walk away. She waited until the sound of his footsteps had faded completely. Then she let out a slow, careful breath and pressed her thumbnail into her palm hard enough to feel it. He was paying attention. The wrong kind of attention. The kind that noticed things. She had been in this pack for 10 years, and no one had noticed that she pointed in precise cardinal directions without hesitation. No one had thought to notice, because they had looked at her eyes and filled in the rest of the picture with assumptions. He had noticed in less than 5 minutes. This was a problem. She went back to the rosemary with hands that were almost perfectly steady and thought about how quickly she could move her departure forward, and whether 2 years of careful saving was enough, and whether Mina's contact in the neutral territory was still reliable. She thought about a voice that was low and unhurried. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm again. She thought about the rosemary. Mina, when Nora told her, set down the mortar she was working with and looked at her with the expression of someone receiving news they had been expecting and hoping would not arrive. "The Alpha King," Mina said. "He noticed something," Nora said. "He's observant, more observant than anyone here has been in 10 years. What did he notice? That I pointed correctly without looking." She paused. He didn't say it was wrong. He just said I pointed precisely. And then he said, Mina repeated, in a way that meant something. Mina was quiet for a moment. She picked up the mortar again, not to work with it, just to have something in her hands. How long is he here? A week. Possibly more. There are territory discussions, something about the border agreements being renegotiated. So, you have a week. At minimum. Mina set the mortar down again. Nora, you have been planning to leave for 2 years. I have watched you plan and save and map and not leave for 2 years. Tell me honestly, what is stopping you? Nora looked at the wall. Or rather, she aimed her gaze at the wall in the way she always aimed her gaze at things, slightly past rather than directly at. The timing has never been right. The timing, Mina said, gently and without any particular emphasis, has been right for at least 8 months. Nora said nothing. Is it Kadric? Mina asked. I met him yesterday. I spoke to him for 4 minutes in a garden. That isn't what I asked. Nora's jaw tightened. It can't be. I don't know him. I have a plan, and the plan doesn't include an Alpha King who asks too many questions. No, Mina agreed. It doesn't. She said nothing more on the subject, which was one of the things Nora had always appreciated about Mina. She knew when she had said enough. Nora spent the rest of the day doing her usual things. She helped in the kitchens in the morning, where she was given simple tasks that no one thought required sight, which was fine because she could do them in the dark if necessary, and frequently did. She sat in the great hall for the midday meal and listened to the Pax Alpha perform his version of himself for the visiting king, with the slightly exhausting energy of a man who wants very much to be impressive. She went back to the garden in the afternoon. She told herself she went to the garden because she always went to the garden in the afternoon. Kadric was not there. She was annoyed at herself for noticing his absence. She was more annoyed at herself for the specific quality of the noticing, which was not the simple cataloging of information that she usually applied to the world, but something closer to disappointment, which was an emotion she genuinely could not afford and was not going to entertain. She pulled weeds. She was very thorough about it. He found her at dinner. Not found her in any dramatic sense. He was seated at the high table. She was seated at her usual place near the side wall where the Pax wards and dependents sat, and there was an entire room between them. But he looked at her. She felt it before she located it, that particular quality of attention that she had identified in the garden, and which her body had apparently decided to treat as a tracking signal. She did not look back. She ate her food. She kept her eyes appropriately unfocused and her face appropriately mild, and she did not look at the high table. She was aware of him looking at her for most of the meal. When the formalities were over and the hall began its usual post-dinner dissolution into smaller conversations, she stood and began making her way toward the door with the careful, slightly deliberate gait she used in unfamiliar or crowded spaces. She made it approximately halfway across the room. Lady Nora. She stopped. She turned toward the voice with the correct slight delay. He was closer than she had calculated, which meant he had moved toward her, which meant he had intended to intercept her, which was information she stored carefully. Your Majesty, she said. She aimed her gaze at his throat. I wanted to ask if I could walk you to your rooms, he said. The hall is crowded. It was a perfectly reasonable offer. It was the kind of offer people made to her constantly. She had accepted it hundreds of times from dozens of people, had let them guide her elbow through doorways she could have navigated perfectly well alone, had thanked them with the warm, slightly simplified gratitude that people expected from her. She said, That's very kind. Thank you. He came to her left side. He didn't take her arm immediately, the way most people did, impatient to assume the role of guide. He waited until she had oriented herself, and then he said quietly, There's a step up at the door. About 2 inches. I know, she said. Then, catching herself, I've counted the steps before. In this room. Smart, he said. Not condescending. Just that. They walked out of the hall and into the corridor. He matched his pace to hers without comment. He didn't try to steer her. He simply walked beside her and said, as they reached the first turn, "Left here," in the same quiet tone, and she turned left, which she would have done anyway, but which she accepted as though she had needed the information. They walked in silence for a moment. "How long have you lived with this pack?" he asked. "Since I was 12, she said. "My parents died. Alpha Varent took me in, and before that?" The question was more specific than people usually managed. Most people, told about parents dying, made a sympathetic sound and moved past it. He had moved toward it. "Another pack," she said carefully. "Farther north." "Which one?" She hesitated for half a second. "The Greyvale pack. It's very small. Most people don't know it." "I know it," he said. Of course he did. He governed 5 territories. He probably knew every pack in all of them. "Then you know it doesn't exist anymore," she said. "After the border wars, it was absorbed." "Yes," he said quietly. "I know." Something in his tone suggested that this was not new information, and that he had perhaps already known more about her history than she had assumed. She stored that, too. She was storing a great deal about this man. They had reached the corridor that led to the dependent's wing. She stopped. "I can find my way from here," she said. "Thank you." He stopped beside her. There was a pause. "Nora," he said. Just her name. No title, no lady, just her name in that low, unhurried voice. She waited. "The stars are very bright tonight," he said. Through that window, he said it conversationally, pleasantly, the way you mention weather. It was, of course, a test. The most elegant test anyone had ever set her. Not a demand, not an accusation. Just a piece of information offered to someone who supposedly could not use it, to see what they did with it. She kept her face perfectly still. She aimed her gaze past his shoulder. "I'm glad," she said quietly. "I used to love stars." She said it with exactly the right amount of wistfulness. Past tense, used to. The gentle grief of someone who had lost something. Another pause. "Good night, Nora," he said. "Good night, Your Majesty," she said. She walked down the corridor to her room and closed the door and stood in the dark with her back against it and finally looked at whatever she wanted, which was the ceiling, which was not what she wanted to look at, but which was safe. She had passed the test. She was almost certain she had passed the test. She was also almost certain he knew she had passed it deliberately. Which was worse. She moved her timeline forward. Not by a little, entirely. She sat on the floor of her room that night with her lamp uncovered and her map spread out, and she stopped being careful and started being urgent. Because urgent was what the situation required, and she had spent 2 years being careful, and it had not resulted in her being anywhere except exactly where she had started. She needed 4 more things. Money, which she had, a convincing reason to leave the pack grounds without an escort, which was harder. A horse, which she did not have and could not easily acquire. And enough of a head start that the pack wouldn't catch her before she crossed into neutral territory, which required leaving at night and leaving cleanly. She lay awake until well past midnight constructing and dismantling plans. She had a plan by morning that was not perfect but was functional. She was going to implement it in 3 days, which was as soon as she could arrange the last pieces without moving so quickly that she attracted attention. She went about the next day normally. Garden in the morning. Kitchens at midday. She listened for news of the Alpha King's movements and learned through the usual channels that he had spent the morning in extended territory discussions with Alpha Varent, which meant he was occupied, and she was, provisionally, safe to move through her day without managing him. She let herself feel relieved about this for approximately 40 seconds. Then she went back to the Rosemary. He found her in the garden at mid-afternoon. She heard him before she saw him, which was normal. She also heard that he was not alone, which was new. 2 sets of footsteps, his and someone else's, lighter and quicker. "I should warn you," the lighter footsteps said, in a voice that was younger than his and considerably more cheerful. "He's been talking about the garden since yesterday morning. I've heard about the herb garden approximately 9 times. "Aldrich," Kaedrich said. "I'm just saying, 9 times. You can go. I'm your attendant. I go where you go. Then be quiet." Nora kept her face toward the rosemary. She was constructing her expression into something pleasantly neutral and trying to decide whether the information that he had mentioned the garden 9 times was something she was going to allow herself to have feelings about, and deciding firmly that she was not. "Good afternoon," Kaedrich said. "Good afternoon," she said. She aimed her gaze at his chest. "This is Aldrich," he said. "He insists on being wherever I am. He sounds friendly," Nora said. "I am extremely friendly," Aldrich said with what she could hear was genuine enthusiasm. "Is that time?" "I love time." "Can I don't touch her plants?" Kaedrich said. "I wasn't going to touch them. I was going to admire them. You were going to touch them. Maybe one." Nora found that her mouth was doing something at the corner that she controlled immediately. She heard Aldrich make a muffled sound that suggested he had been stopped by some gesture she couldn't see. "We won't disturb your work," Kaedrich said, which should have meant they would leave. Instead, they stayed. Kaedrich stood approximately 4 feet to her left, not speaking, apparently simply existing in the garden. Aldrich made quiet sounds of someone who was being physically restrained from touching plants by the force of stern looks alone. It was, objectively, the strangest social situation she had been in for some time. In 10 years of performing blindness, no one had simply stood near her in comfortable silence. People either helped her with excessive cheerfulness or left her alone. They did not simply exist beside her without agenda. She kept working. She found a patch of wild thyme she had known was there, and began carefully extracting it. "The mint is overgrowing toward the thyme bed," Kaedrich said suddenly. She paused. "Yes, I've been managing it. If you cut it back at the root rather than the stem, it won't spread as quickly." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I've been doing it gradually so the cut sections can be dried. Mint dries well." A pause. "That's efficient," he said. "I try," she said. Another pause. "You're managing the whole garden yourself?" he asked. "Mina oversees it. I help." "The layout is impressive. The companion planting specifically. Did you plan it?" The question was direct enough that she answered it honestly before she thought about it. "Yes, 3 years ago. I read about companion planting and rearranged the beds. You read about it," he said. She heard what she had said. "Mina read to me," she corrected smoothly. "She reads to me often. That's kind of her," he said. "She is kind," Nora agreed. Her voice was perfectly level. She went back to the time. From behind Kaedrich, she heard Aldrich make a very small sound, not words, just a sound, the sound of a person absorbing information and filing it somewhere. She did not like that sound. They stayed for another 20 minutes. Kaedrich asked her occasional questions about the plants, specific and knowledgeable questions, the questions of someone who knew something about growing things rather than someone making conversation. She answered them. They fell into a rhythm that felt, dangerously, like 2 people who were comfortable with each other, which they were not and could not be. When they left, Aldrich said cheerfully, "It was lovely to meet you, Nora," and she said the same, and then they were gone, and she was alone in the garden with her time and her accelerated timeline, and the absolutely certain knowledge that she had said she read, not Mina read to her, and that he had heard it. She moved her timeline forward by another day. She was leaving in 2 days. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm and got back to work. She almost made it. This was the thing she would think about afterward, in the strange, stretched time of the aftermath, when she had the leisure to replay it. She had been so close. Everything had been in place. The money was in the lining of her traveling coat. The contact had been reached through Mina and had confirmed. She had identified a horse in the pack's stable that was overlooked enough to be borrowable in the night hours without immediate notice. She had her route. She had 1 day left. And then Alpha Vorant announced at dinner that there would be a formal claiming review. She heard the words from her usual seat near the side wall and felt the blood leave her face. A claiming review was not, on its own, unusual. They happened periodically in larger packs, a formal process by which unmated omegas of age were assessed for available matches. What was unusual was the timing. What was unusual was that Vorant announced it with the particular careful blankness of a man who had been asked to do something he didn't entirely want to do and had decided to comply anyway. What was unusual was that she caught, from her position near the side wall with her excellent peripheral vision that no one knew was excellent, the Alpha King's attendant Aldrich lean close to Kadric and murmur something, and Kadric's jaw do something very small and very controlled. The review was in the morning. All unmated omegas of age were required to present. Nora sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes appropriately unfocused, and her mind moving very fast through the specific architecture of what had just happened. A claiming review required direct assessment by the pack's healers. The healers checked for full capacity. Full capacity in an Omega who had been registered as having impaired sight for 10 years would involve a physical examination by old Mina, who would of course confirm the impairment, but it would also potentially involve a secondary assessment by a healer unfamiliar with her case. Someone who hadn't been maintaining the pretense for a decade, and who might look more carefully. She had to leave tonight. She went to Mina's room as soon as the dinner dispersal gave her cover. Mina had already heard. Mina was already standing by her table with a bundle prepared, the drops, travel provisions, a letter for her contact. Tonight, Mina said. Tonight, Nora agreed. 3rd hour past midnight. The Eastern Gate Guard changes at that hour and there's a gap. I know. She had mapped this 2 years ago. Mina, don't thank me, Mina said. Just go. And don't waste the time I bought you. Nora embraced her once, briefly. Then she went back to her room and waited. She did everything correctly. She waited until the 2nd hour past midnight before she moved. She dressed quietly in the dark, which was not difficult. She put on the traveling coat. She took her bag, which had been packed for months. She went to the door and opened it and stepped into the corridor. Aldrich was sitting on the floor outside her door. He stood when she came out, which he did not do with any particular urgency. Just the easy movement of someone who had been sitting comfortably and was now choosing to stand. He looked at her traveling coat. He looked at her bag. He looked at her face. "Hello," he said pleasantly. She said nothing. Her heart was hammering. Her face was still. "He's not here," Aldrich said, which answered a question she hadn't asked. "He sent me. He thought you might be more comfortable with me than with him." A pause. He was probably right. She looked at him. She looked at him directly, which she did not do with people, and she saw a young man with a genuinely open face and eyes that were kind and a little tired. "I'm not going back to my room," she said. "No," Aldrich agreed. "I know." He reached into his jacket and produced something, a folded piece of paper, which he held out to her. "He wanted you to have this before you made any decisions." She took it. She unfolded it. She read it. She read it twice. Her hands, which had been steady all night, developed a faint tremor. The letter was brief, 6 sentences. The handwriting was precise and slightly compressed, the writing of someone who thought carefully before putting anything on paper. It said, "I know you can see. I have known since the garden. I don't know why you did this, and I'm not asking you to tell me tonight. But I am asking you to give me one conversation before you leave, because I think you deserve to make this decision with full information rather than partial information. If you decide to go after that conversation, I won't stop you. I give you my word as Alpha King." At the bottom, in smaller letters, the stars were beautiful last night. I thought you'd want to know. Nora stood in the corridor for a long moment. Aldrich waited, patient and quiet, apparently in no hurry at all. She folded the letter. She put it in her coat pocket. She picked up her bag. "Where is he?" she said. Aldrich took her to the East Tower. Not the main tower where Alpha Vorant received formal guests, but the smaller eastern one that was used for storage in the winter and largely ignored the rest of the year. It had a single round room at the top, reached by a narrow stair, and it had, she realized as she came through the door, a view of the entire valley through 4 open windows. And the stars were, as the letter had promised, extraordinary. Kaedric was standing at one of the windows with his back to the door. He turned when she came in, and for the first time since he had arrived, she looked at him. Directly, without managing her gaze or placing it carefully or keeping it soft and unfocused. He looked like what he was, not because he was performing it, but because it had simply become the shape of him, the particular way that people who carry a great deal of responsibility for a long time start to carry it in their posture and their face. He was not as intimidating as his reputation suggested, which she suspected was deliberate, and not as unreachable as his position implied, which she suspected he did not entirely realize. He looked at her looking at him, and something in his face changed. Not dramatically, just slightly, the way a room changes when a window is opened. "There they are," he said quietly. She understood he meant her eyes. She said, "You said one conversation." "Yes, then say what you need to say." He turned back to the window briefly. "I found out 3 things about you in the first 2 days. You know cardinal directions without looking. You read, and you correct your stories when you realize you've revealed too much, which means you're intelligent enough to catch your own mistakes and careful enough to try to fix them." He turned back to her. "I'm not telling you this to prove I'm clever. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that I've been aware since the first afternoon, and I haven't done anything with that information. I'm not going to use it against you." She looked at him steadily. "Why not?" "Because whatever reason a person has for doing something like this for 10 years, he said, is not a small reason, and I would like to know it, if you're willing to tell me, not so I can evaluate it, because I'd like to understand." She held his gaze. He held hers. The stars through the window were very bright. "Vorant's son," she said finally. "When I was 14. Something in Kaedric's face went very still. "He began paying attention to me," she said, "the kind of attention that moves toward claiming. I was 14. He was 22. She paused. Mina found a solution. The protected status for Omegas with impaired sight. She said it would buy me time. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she agreed. I used it to learn, to plan. I was going to leave. Tonight, he said. Tonight, she confirmed. The claiming review was announced at dinner. I know, he said. I asked Vorant to announce it. The room went very quiet. You, she said carefully. I asked him to call a claiming review, Kaedric said, because it was the fastest way to bring this to a head without confronting you directly, which I thought you'd run from immediately. I was trying to give you less time to disappear before I could speak to you. He paused. I realized that's exactly what happened anyway. She stared at him. You forced a claiming review to corner me. I forced a claiming review, he said, because I've spent 2 days watching the most remarkable person I've encountered in 4 years of running 5 territories try to make herself invisible, and I was running out of time to say so. The word remarkable hung in the air between them. She thought of another conversation, in another garden, in what felt like another life entirely. She pressed that thought down. What do you want? She said. Her voice was direct. She was done with managing things, with performing things. She was looking at him with her real eyes, and she was asking the real question. He looked at her for a moment. To offer you something better than running. I don't need rescue, she said immediately. I know, he said. I'm not offering rescue, I'm offering options. Specifically, I'm offering to make it impossible for Vorant or his son, or anyone else in this pack, to touch your status or your future ever again, in a way that requires nothing from you except that you allow it. He paused. And then, if you want to leave, you leave. Openly, with resources, with my explicit protection, no hiding, no contact in neutral territory, no traveling at the 3rd hour past midnight. She looked at him. And if I don't want to leave, she said. He held her gaze. Something in his expression was very careful and very honest simultaneously, the expression of a man who is being precise about something, because imprecision would be a kind of dishonesty he's not willing to engage in. Then I would very much like to have more conversations with you, he said, in gardens and elsewhere, without the performance. He paused. I think you're extraordinary. I think you've been extraordinary entirely alone for 10 years, and I think that's a waste, and I think you know it is. She stood in the East Tower room with the stars behind her and the letter in her coat pocket, and her real eyes looking at a man who had known her secret for 2 days and said nothing and done nothing except write 6 careful sentences and ask for 1 conversation. She said, "What exactly does making it impossible for Vorant to touch my status involve?" Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, something quieter than a smile. It involves a formal declaration of my personal interest in your future, he said, which, under coalition law, supersedes any Pack Alpha's authority over an Omega in his territory. She absorbed this. You're saying you would declare me under the Alpha King's protection. Yes, that's politically significant. Extremely, people would ask questions. Let them, he said simply. She held his gaze for another long moment. Then, she looked out the window at the stars, which were very bright, and which she was looking at directly and without pretending otherwise for the first time in a very long time. Sit down, she said finally. He sat. She stayed standing because she thought better on her feet and began asking him the questions she actually needed answered. She asked him 11 questions. She knew it was 11 because she counted them as she asked them, a habit from 10 years of precision. He answered every one of them directly, without the political softening she had expected, without the carefully managed version of truth that powerful people usually produced when they wanted something. He answered them the way a person answers when they have decided that honesty is more useful than persuasion. By the time she had asked the 11th question and received the 11th answer, the stars had moved noticeably in the windows, and her legs were tired, and she had sat down at some point without entirely deciding to, in the chair across from his. There's one more thing, she said. Ask it. Aldrich, she said. He knew. Or he figured it out. Within the first day, Kadric confirmed, he noticed you didn't spill your wine at dinner despite the table being crowded and no one warning you the cup was close to the edge. She thought back. She hadn't thought about that. She had been managing larger things. Is he discreet? She asked. Aldrich, Kadric said, is the most discreet person I know. He's also currently sitting on the stairs outside this door, and has been for the past 2 hours, and will not tell anyone what he heard. He's on the stairs right now? He finds stairs comfortable. From outside the door, she heard a muffled voice say, extremely comfortable. She looked at the door. She looked back at Kadric. Something moved in her face that she didn't entirely suppress, and from the slight change in his expression she thought he had seen it. What happens tomorrow? She asked. The claiming review happens, he said. Mina will be present as your primary healer and will assess your sight as she always has. I'll be present as Alpha King observing the process. At the conclusion of the review, I'll make a formal declaration of personal interest in your welfare and future, which closes your case to any claiming consideration for the period of my active interest. He paused. No one will question it. Alpha Kings declaring interest in unmated Omegas is not common, but it's not unheard of. And my interest in you specifically has not been subtle enough for anyone who was paying attention to miss. You weren't being subtle, she said. I was not being subtle, he confirmed. No, she looked at him steadily. Why? It was the simplest question and the most dangerous one, and she asked it directly because she had decided, somewhere between the 6th and 7th question, that she was done with performing things in front of this man. He met her eyes. Because subtlety felt dishonest. You have been performing something for 10 years. I didn't want to perform anything back at you. She held his gaze. You don't know me. No, he agreed. But I would like to. Genuinely, not as a political consideration and not because you need someone to know you, because you are interesting and sharp and you built a functional herb garden on companion planting principles you learned from books you read secretly at night. And you have spent 10 years developing your mind in complete isolation, and I find that I want to know what's in it. She said nothing for a moment. I don't know how to do this, she said. Any of this. I've been managing everything alone for 10 years. I don't know how to let someone. She stopped. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to know how. I'm asking you to try. From outside the door, Aldrich's voice came through with unabashed cheerfulness. He's very patient. Genuinely, I've seen him negotiate international borders with less anxiety than he's shown in the past 2 days. It's actually quite sweet. Aldrich, Kaedrich said. Still here. I'm aware. Just wanted you to know I heard all of that and it was lovely. Nora looked at the door for a moment. Then she looked back at Kaedrich, who had the expression of a man who is deeply resigned to his attendant, and also, underneath that, something warmer and more real. He's terrible, she said. He's invaluable, Kaedrich said. Unfortunately, those aren't mutually exclusive. Something in his face shifted, quietly, like weather changing in a direction that might be good. No, he said. They aren't. They sat in the East Tower room for another hour. She talked and he listened, and then he talked and she listened, and at some point the conversation stopped being about plans and declarations and political protections and became something else, something quieter and more ordinary and significantly more dangerous. She told him about the books she had read. He told her about the border negotiations, the real version, not the diplomatic account. She told him about the companion planting, the 3 weeks it had taken to reorganize the beds, the argument she had had with herself about the mint. He told her about Aldrich, who had been assigned to him 4 years ago as a junior attendant and had never been reassigned despite a series of incidents that should have logically resulted in it. From outside the door, Aldrich said those were not incidents, they were misunderstandings. Neither of them responded to this. She did not decide exactly when she stopped thinking about leaving. It was not a single moment. It was a gradual shift, the way the quality of light changes at dawn, not dramatically, just present, and then different, and then present again in a new way. When she finally stood to leave, the 4th hour past midnight had come and gone. The review is at mid-morning, he said. I'll be there, she said. She moved toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the latch. Kaedrich, she said. She had not used his name before. She felt him go slightly still. Thank you, she said, for the letter, for asking first. A pause. You needed the choice to be yours, he said. She looked at the door and not at him because if she looked at him she was going to do something she was not ready to do. Yes, she said. I did. She opened the door. Aldrich was indeed on the stairs, sitting comfortably, and he smiled at her with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who has decided to simply be glad about something without making it complicated. Good night, Nora, he said. Good night, Aldrich, she said. She walked back to her room in the dark, and she did not need to count steps or keep her hand near the wall. And she looked at everything she passed with her real eyes wide open, and the corridor was very ordinary and very beautiful. The claiming review was held in the PAC's formal receiving hall, which smelled of old wood and winter herbs, and the particular anxiety of a room being used for something no one was entirely comfortable with. Nora arrived precisely on time. She was dressed in her usual gray dress, which she had chosen deliberately. She could have worn something different, something that signaled a shift. She had decided against signaling anything yet. She walked in with her usual gait and her eyes in their usual position, and took her place with the other unmated Omegas of assessing age, 6 women ranging from 17 to 26, all of them looking at the proceedings with varying degrees of resignation and nerves. Mina was seated at the healer's table, her face arranged into the composed blankness of a woman who knows exactly what is happening and has prepared for it. She did not look at Nora when she came in. Nora did not look at her. Kaedric was seated to Alpha Verence right at the formal table, which was where the Alpha King's position placed him. He was looking at the proceedings with the measured attention of someone who is observing process rather than outcome. He did not look at Nora when she came in. She noted all of this with peripheral vision and kept her face appropriate. The review proceeded. Each Omega came forward in turn. Mina or the PAC's secondary healer assessed. Questions were asked in the formal language of the claiming protocols, the old words that felt like something out of a book, and somehow also like something completely real and present. When Nora's name was called, she came forward with her hands loose at her sides and her breathing deliberate and steady. Mina assessed her. The drops had done their work as they had for 10 years, the cloudiness present and convincing. Mina confirmed, in her steady professional voice, that the impairment was unchanged, that full sight had not been recovered, that the protected status remained applicable. Alpha Vorant leaned forward. His son was seated beside him, and she felt the familiar quality of that attention, older now, still the same shape. Given the standing impairment, Vorant said, I would move to maintain the current protected status pending further medical development. Which was what he always said. The formal way of saying not yet without saying never. I have an addition to the record, Kaedric said. The room went quiet. When an Alpha King spoke at a PAC proceeding in those particular quiet tones, things went quiet. Vorant looked at him. Kaedric looked at the official recorder and not at Vorant. I am making formal declaration of personal interest in the welfare and future of Nora, registered ward of this PAC, under Coalition Provision 47, which places her status and any future proceedings regarding her person under the direct purview of the Alpha King's court for the duration of my declared interest. The recorder was writing very quickly. This declaration, Kaedric continued, still in that level unhurried voice, supersedes any PAC-level proceedings, claims, or reviews regarding her person until such time as I formally withdraw the interest, which I have no current intention of doing. Total silence. Nora, who was still standing at the assessment point, kept her face still and her eyes appropriately aimed and her hands loose at her sides. Vorant's face was doing several things at once. The primary thing was calculation. The secondary thing was frustration, carefully managed. The tertiary thing, when his eyes moved briefly to his son, was something that looked almost like relief. The complicated relief of a man who has been handed a reason not to have a problem. The declaration is noted, the recorder said. Good, Kaedric said. And that was that. The review concluded. People dispersed with the slightly stunned energy of those who have witnessed something significant and are still processing it. Nora went to Mina, who squeezed her hands once, very briefly, and said nothing. She turned and found Aldrich at her elbow. He'd like to walk in the garden, Aldrich said. If you're available. No obligations. He specifically asked me to say no obligations. He specifically asked you to say no obligations, she repeated. Verbatim, Aldrich confirmed. She went to the garden. Kaedric was already there, standing where she usually stood by the rosemary. which she suspected was not accidental. He turned when she came in and they looked at each other, directly and without management or performance, and the morning light was very clear. "Vorant's son," she said, "is leaving this territory with his father's blessing at the end of the week," Kadric said. "I had a conversation with Vorant this morning." Early, she looked at him. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind with words," he said, "and also the kind with the awareness that I am the Alpha King and certain situations in pacts under my coalition's protection are not acceptable." She was quiet for a moment. He agreed. With enthusiasm, Kadric said, "Vorant is fundamentally a practical man." He saw immediately that his son's departure was the practical solution. She stood in the garden in the morning light and felt something move through her that she did not have a word for. Something that was not relief exactly, because relief implied she had been afraid, and she had moved past fear into something more complicated than that years ago. It was closer to the feeling of a weight being set down. Not the dramatic release of a burden you've been struggling under, the quiet discovery that something you had forgotten you were carrying is no longer there. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I could have managed it." "I know that too," he said. "You've been managing everything alone for 10 years. You're very good at it." He paused. "But you don't have to anymore, if you don't want to." She looked at the rosemary. She looked at him. "I still don't entirely know how to do this," she said. "Neither do I," he said. "For what it's worth. I've been running 5 territories for 4 years, and I'm considerably less competent at this particular thing than at any of that." She held his gaze. Something in her face moved. "That's not reassuring," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's honest." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned to the rosemary and said, "The mint needs cutting back again. The east side." She heard him move to stand beside her. "Show me," he said. "I'll help." She looked at him sideways, the full direct sideways look that she had not used on anyone in 10 years. "You're an Alpha King," she said. "You don't cut mint." "I do today," he said. "Show me." She showed him. She stopped pretending, not all at once. It would have been simpler if it had been all at once, a single dramatic moment of revelation, her eyes opening fully in front of the entire pack, a gasp from the assembled witnesses. That was not how it happened. It happened in small increments, one revealed thing at a time, like a room that is lightening gradually from the east so slowly you cannot identify the exact moment it becomes day. First, she stopped adjusting her gaze when she was alone. That was easy, because she had been doing it alone anyway, in her room at night with the lamp uncovered. But now she did it in the garden when no one was watching, and in the corridor at off hours, and she let herself look at things fully and without apology, and it felt like stretching a muscle that had been held in one position for so long it had started to think that was its natural shape. Then she stopped adjusting it when only Kadric was present. This happened without a formal decision. She was in the garden with him on the 3rd day after the claiming review, and she simply forgot, or didn't bother, or decided not to, and she looked at something he pointed out in the mint bed with her full direct gaze, and then looked at him, and he was looking at her with that expression that she was starting to be able to read, and neither of them mentioned it. Then she stopped adjusting it around Aldrich, who responded to this development by saying, "Oh, thank goodness. I was genuinely concerned you were going to maintain that indefinitely, and it was making me anxious," and then continuing the conversation he had been having about nothing in particular. The pack noticed something was different. She could tell from the quality of the looks she received in the great hall and the kitchens, the slightly puzzled doubling back look of people who have catalogued someone as a certain type of person and are encountering evidence that the catalogue was wrong. Nobody said anything directly. She suspected this was partly because nobody had quite figured out what had changed, and partly because the Alpha King's formal declaration had altered her status in ways that made people careful about how they engaged with anything related to her. She did not mind being looked at differently. She had been looked at a certain way for 10 years, and it had been useful, and it had also been, she admitted to herself now, genuinely lonely in ways she had not let herself think about directly, because thinking about it directly would have made it harder to maintain. Loneliness was efficient, she had decided at some point. Loneliness kept your variables manageable. Loneliness did not ask questions you weren't ready to answer, or notice things you weren't ready to have noticed. Loneliness also, she was discovering, had a weight that you stopped feeling only when it was lifted. She and Kadric spent the mornings in the garden, which had become their habit with the naturalness of two people who are both drawn to the same place, and have simply stopped pretending the overlap is accidental. She talked about what she was doing and why, and he asked good questions, and sometimes he told her things about the territories and the coalition and the negotiations that were ongoing with Vorent, and she listened and asked her own questions, and the conversations had the quality she had only ever found in books before, of going places she hadn't anticipated when they began. She had not anticipated any of this. She had anticipated, 10 days ago, a third-hour departure through the eastern gate with a borrowed horse and enough money for neutral territory. She had anticipated beginning again somewhere else, alone with a new name and a different cover story, continuing the manageable loneliness in a different location. She had been prepared for that. She had made her peace with it. She had not made any peace with this because there had been no reason to make peace with something she hadn't imagined. On the 5th day after the claiming review, she and Kadric were in the East Tower room again, which had become a second meeting place with the same naturalness as the garden, and she was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, because she liked sitting on floors and had stopped performing preferences she didn't actually have. And he was at the window, and they were talking about something she could no longer remember the beginning of. "Why did you stay?" she asked, interrupting herself mid-thought because the question had been somewhere in the back of her mind for 5 days and had chosen this moment to surface. He turned from the window. "You said a week," she said, "for the territory discussions." "It's been longer. The discussions are ongoing," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Kadric," he held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "I stayed because of you. The territory discussions could have been concluded in 2 more days. I extended them." She absorbed this. "That's politically complicated," she said. "Yes, people will have opinions about it." "People have opinions about everything I do," he said. "I have spent 4 years learning to make decisions based on what I believe is right rather than what generates fewer opinions. I recommend it." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not who they'll think I am," she said. "Your court. Your advisors. They'll see an Omega Ward from a small pack with impaired sight and no status. Your sight is not impaired," he said. "They don't know that. They will," he said simply. "You don't have to manage what they know. You can simply be what you are, and what you are is more than enough." She looked at him. "That's easy to say," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm saying it anyway because it's true." She stood up from the floor. She crossed the room to where he was standing at the window and stood beside him and looked out at the valley below, the whole spread of it visible in the late afternoon light, territory that was not hers and not his, and yet felt, in this moment, like something shared. "What do you actually want?" she said. "Not what's politically sensible, not what the Declaration covers. What do you want?" He was quiet for a moment. "You," he said. "Specifically you, not the idea of you or a version of you that's been made more manageable. You, as you are, who reads books in secret and knows cardinal directions and argues with herself about mint and looked at me for the first time with your real eyes in this room and didn't look away." She stood at the window and felt the weight of 10 years of careful management press against the specific gravity of what he had just said, and she understood, with the clarity of something that has been true for longer than you've admitted it, that these two things could not exist in the same space. She had to choose. She looked at him, sidelong, with her real eyes and her real face, and nothing managed. "Ask me again in 2 days," she said. "I need to think." "2 days," he said. Understood. She looked back out the window. 2 days was not very long. She had spent 10 years thinking. She thought she could manage 2 days. She was not sure she was going to need them. She needed 1 day. She knew the answer by morning, which was not a surprise exactly, more the confirmation of something she had known for longer than she had allowed herself to admit. The knowing sat in her chest with the quiet certainty of something that is simply true, regardless of whether you have examined it yet, and she had been examining it for 6 days without quite calling it by its name. She went to find Mina. Mina was in her workroom, which was where Mina always was, surrounded by the organized chaos of someone who knows exactly where everything is, but has no interest in making it legible to anyone else. She looked up when Nora came in and set down what she was holding with the particular care of a woman who intends to pay full attention. "Tell me," Mina said. Nora told her, not all of it, but enough. The tower room, the letter, the 11 questions, the mint, the way he looked at things and the way he listened, and the specific quality of his attention that made her feel seen without making her feel studied. Mina listened without interrupting. "Are you asking for my opinion?" she said when Nora finished. "No," Nora said. "I know what I think. I'm telling you because you're the only person who has known all of this from the beginning, and I wanted you to know this part too." Mina was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good," in the same way she said everything, plainly and completely. "Go then. Stop thinking at me and go." Nora went. She found him in the garden, which was where she had known he would be, because in 6 days they had established a gravity between them that pulled them both toward the same spaces at the same times, and she had stopped pretending this was coincidental. He was standing by the east wall where the rosemary grew thickest, not doing anything in particular, just standing the way he sometimes stood, present and unhurried, with his hands in his pockets and his face turned toward the morning. He heard her coming. He turned. She looked at him with her real eyes and her real face, and nothing between them. "I thought about it," she said. "1 day," he said. I said 2. I know, I only needed 1. Something in his face shifted, carefully, the way he shifted when he was feeling something he wasn't going to perform. "And?" he said. She stood in the garden in the morning light and thought about 10 years and all the things those 10 years had been and all the things they hadn't, and she thought about neutral territory and a borrowed horse and a contact who was reliable, and she thought about sitting on the floor of a tower room and being asked what was in her mind and answering, honestly, and she thought about the first morning she had heard a voice she had never heard before and felt the constant hum of her careful management simply stop. "I want to know what it's like," she said, "not to perform anything, not to manage anything, not to be managing how much someone knows about me or what they're going to do with it." She paused. "I've never had that. I don't know what it feels like. I want to find out." He looked at her. "With me specifically," he said. "Not quite a question. You're the one who asked," she said. Something moved through his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family as one, something quieter and more genuine. "Then yes," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment longer. "I'm going to be difficult," she said. "I've been alone for 10 years. I have opinions about everything, and I'm not going to stop having them, and I'm not good at accepting help graciously, and I will almost certainly argue with you about herb gardens and border policy in equal measure. I'm counting on it," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I'm serious." "So am I," he said. "I've had people agree with me for 4 years. I find I'm very tired of it." She held his gaze. Something in her chest that had been very tightly held for a very long time released by a degree she felt physically, a small shift in the machinery of herself, A door opened that had been closed for so long she had stopped thinking of it as a door. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. From behind her, from the direction of the garden gate, Aldrich's voice arrived with its characteristic blend of cheerfulness and complete lack of shame. "I want you both to know I have been waiting outside that gate for 20 minutes, and I am deeply relieved. Can we go inside now? It's very warm, and I missed breakfast." Nora looked at the gate. She looked at Kaedric. "He was outside the gate this whole time," she said. "He's always somewhere adjacent," Kaedric said. "You get used to it." "I'm very discreet," Aldrich said. "You are standing outside a garden gate announcing you've been there for 20 minutes, Nora said. "I waited until you were done," Aldrich said. "That's the discreet part." She looked at Kaedric. He looked back at her with the expression of someone who has made his peace with something and found it surprisingly good. She felt the corner of her mouth move, and this time she did not stop it. "Come in, Aldrich," she said. The gate opened. Aldrich came in looking extremely pleased with himself and also genuinely hungry, and the three of them went inside, and the garden was very quiet behind them in the warm morning, and the rosemary was growing well, and the mint was neatly cut, and everything was very ordinary and very different from how it had been. 2 months later, Nora looked at things constantly. This was the adjustment no one had told her about. Not Mina. Not Kaedric. Not the 3 books she had read on the subject of significant life changes, none of which had been particularly useful. The adjustment of simply allowing herself to be visible, of walking into a room and not managing her gaze and not performing anything, and having her real eyes meet the real eyes of people who were looking at her as what she actually was, rather than what she had arranged for them to see. It was, she discovered, considerably more complicated than the performance had been. The performance had rules, clear, tested, reliable, eyes soft and unfocused, gaze placed at approximately chest level, reactions delayed by half a second, questions answered in the slightly simplified register of someone whose world is smaller than it appears. She had been very good at the performance. The performance had made sense. Being visible had no rules, or rather it had the infinitely complex rules of actual human interaction, which were not written down anywhere, and which she was learning to navigate the way she had learned everything else for the past decade, through careful observation and the occasional significant mistake. There had been mistakes. The first time she sat at a formal dinner in Kaedric's court, rather than at a sidewall, she had been so conscious of being looked at that she had knocked over her own wine, which she had not done in 10 years of performing impaired sight, and which Aldrich had called deeply ironic. The first time she had been introduced to one of Kaedric's senior advisors, a woman of considerable political experience, and the particular sharp attention of someone who has survived a long time by noticing things, she had overcorrected from 10 years of looking at nothing, and met the woman's eyes so directly that the woman had blinked and said yes. I see in the tone of someone who had been handed a lot of information at once. She told Kaedric about the mistakes, because she had found in 2 months that telling him things was different from telling anyone else had ever been. He listened without the particular quality of attention that is really waiting for an opportunity to respond, and he asked follow-up questions that were specific and sometimes unexpected, and occasionally he said something that reframed the thing she had said in a way she hadn't seen, and she found this addictive in a way she was still getting used to. "The advisor," he said, when she told him about the eye contact incident. "That's Dara. What did you make of her?" "Sharp," Nora said immediately. "Observant, she categorized me in about 30 seconds, and then started revising the categorization almost immediately. She's good at adjusting her model when new information arrives. She liked you," Kaedric said. Nora blinked. She looked startled. She looked startled and then interested. Dara does not look interested at many people. He paused. She asked me afterwards what your background was in political theory. She asked what my background was in political theory, Nora repeated, based on the single thing you said about the Eastern Border Agreement at dinner. I said one sentence about the Eastern Border Agreement. It was a good sentence, he said. She noticed. She was quiet for a moment. I was performing being a person who says slightly too much without realizing it, she said, as a way of seeming less calculated. I know, he said. You're still doing it occasionally. You probably always will. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. She looked at him. Doesn't it bother you? Not knowing which version is they're all versions of you, he said simply. I'm not looking for the one true unperformed Nora. I'm looking at the whole person, which includes someone who has 10 years of specific skills and instincts that aren't going to vanish because the circumstances changed. She held his gaze for a moment. That's a very reasonable thing to say, she said. I have my moments, he said. She looked out the window of the room she had been given in his court, which was large enough to have a window seat, which she used constantly because she could look out at things from it. Below was a garden, not as well tended as the one she had left, and she had mentioned this twice and was putting together a reorganization plan. Mina sends her regards, she said. In her letter this morning. How is she? Excellent. She's taken on a new assistant, apparently. Younger than she'd like, but competent. Good. They were quiet for a moment. She was aware that this was one of the things she hadn't expected, the easy quiet of being in a room with someone and not filling it, not performing, not managing. She had not known that quiet could feel like something to have rather than something to fill. The council session tomorrow, she said. The trade agreement discussion. Yes, Dara told me I could sit in, she said, if I wanted. He looked at her. Do you want to? She thought about it honestly, which was something she was allowing herself to do more. Yes, she said. I want to see how the full process works. I've only read about it. Then sit in, he said. You'll probably have thoughts. I'll definitely have thoughts. Good, he said. You can tell me afterward which ones I missed. She looked at him sideways. You're very confident that my thoughts will be useful. You've been right about 7 things in the past 2 months that my senior advisors missed, he said. I've started writing them down. She blinked. You've been writing them down. In the interest of patterns, he said. It seemed methodical. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest did the thing it had been doing for 2 months, the quiet, unceremonious thing that she had no formal name for, but which felt like the opposite of the weight she had carried for 10 years. Not dramatic, just present, just steady. I should probably tell you something, she said. He waited. I thought I was going to spend my whole life managing everything alone, she said. I had made peace with it. I was genuinely at peace with it. She paused. I wasn't expecting you. I want you to know that I understand that this is not something I was looking for, and it happened anyway, and I'm not unhappy about that. I'm not unhappy about any of it. He looked at her for a moment with that careful, honest expression that she had learned meant he was about to say something true. Neither am I, he said, in case that needed saying. It didn't, she said, but I'm glad you said it. Outside the window, the garden was very green in the autumn light and needed significant reorganization, and she was going to start on it next week. Inside the room, the quiet was easy and full, and she was looking at everything directly with her real eyes, and there was nothing she was performing and nothing she was managing, and the sensation of this was still new enough to notice and ordinary enough to trust. She turned back to the window. She was going to need more mint for the reorganization. She would write to Mina. The night she stopped pretending entirely was a Thursday, which was an entirely appropriate day for things to be completed. She was in the garden below the window she had been looking out of for 2 months, working in the last of the evening light with the particular satisfaction of someone who is doing something physical after a day of mostly thinking. She had the reorganization half finished, the companion planting rearranged, the mint properly contained, a new bed for the rosemary that would get better morning light. Kaedric came out and sat on the low stone wall and watched her work, which he did sometimes, and which she had stopped finding strange and started finding comfortable. "Dara wants to know," he said after a while, "if you'd be willing to review the draft of the Eastern Border language before tomorrow." "She wants me to review it," Nora said. She said, and I'm quoting directly, "The ward has better instincts about ambiguous phrasing than anyone on my team." She called me the ward. She calls everyone something abbreviated. I'm the king. Aldrich is the boy. You're the ward. He paused. It's her version of affection. Nora straightened up and looked at him over the rosemary. "I'll review the draft tonight. I'll tell her." He watched her for a moment. "How's the garden coming?" "It'll be better by spring," she said. "The bones are good. It just needed organizing." "Like most things," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the garden with that quality of attention he sometimes turned on things that were not the task at hand, the particular focus of someone who finds something genuinely interesting and is not pretending to for politeness. "Kaedric," she said. He looked at her. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want to say it plainly without managing how it lands." He waited, and she appreciated that he had become very good at waiting. She set down what she was holding. She dusted her hands off on her dress. She stood in the reorganized garden in the last of the evening light and looked at him directly with her real eyes and said the true thing. "I love you," she said. "I've probably loved you since the tower room, which was absurdly fast and not something I planned, and I've examined it carefully, and I'm satisfied it's real and not a consequence of the situation. I love your questions and the way you listen and the fact that you've been writing down my thoughts in a notebook and your, frankly, unreasonable patience with Aldrich. I love that you looked at me in a garden for 30 seconds and saw something everyone else had missed for 10 years. I love that you gave me the choice." She paused. I wanted to say it plainly, so I said it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something open all the way through, not the carefully managed version of feeling that people who carry a lot of responsibility learn to produce, but the real thing, unmanaged, present. Then he got off the wall and came to where she was standing and said, very quietly, "I love you. I have loved you since you told me you pointed in precise cardinal directions out of habit, and I understood you were lying, and also that you were extraordinary, and also, somehow, that you were mine, which is not a thing I'm generally given to thinking quickly, but which was simply and immediately true." She looked up at him. "That's very specific." "You appreciate specificity," he said. "I do," she agreed. He reached up and touched her face, careful and certain, the way he did things. She leaned into it slightly, which was something she had been doing for 2 months and which she had stopped being surprised by. From the direction of the garden gate, inevitable and cheerful, "I am outside this gate again," Aldrich announced, being very discreet. "And I want you both to know that I heard all of that, and it was the best thing that has happened this entire week, including the trade agreement draft, which was also quite good." Nora kept her eyes on Kaedric's face. "Aldrich," she said. "Yes?" "Come in," she said. "And then go find your own dinner. We'll see you at breakfast." A pause. "That," Aldrich said with audible satisfaction, "is a queen's voice, Your Majesty." The gate opened and closed, and his footsteps went across the garden and away, and then it was quiet, and the stars were coming out above the garden the way they came out every evening, and she was looking at them directly with her real eyes wide open. She had spent 10 years not looking at things. She intended to spend a considerable amount of time making up for it. Thank you for staying with Nora through every careful step and every quiet revelation. This story grew from a question that I find genuinely interesting, which is what a person becomes when they are forced to live in one direction for a long time and then are no longer forced to. Nora did not waste her 10 years. She built a mind inside them. She built herself. And she was ready when the right moment arrived, because she had never stopped being ready, even when it looked like she had given up. If you have ever felt that you were surviving something rather than living it, I hope Nora reminded you that surviving well is its own kind of preparation. The things you learn in your quiet years do not disappear when the quiet ends. Thank you for listening. Until the next story.